All right. Well, thank you for coming. Should I start? Okay, thank you for coming. My research is a critical discourse analysis of the intersections between immigration, race, and nation over the last 165 years. It covers a large amount of history and data, so it is necessarily brief, but I'd be happy to answer more detailed questions afterwards. So these are a couple of quotes from the 1850s, which help to situate the analysis that follows. So long before the Australian colonies joined together to form the nation state of Australia, the discourses of equal rights and liberty that underpinned the nascent nation were being propounded as its key features. Yet while population was to be encouraged to more quarters, the arrival of Chinese immigrants during the gold rushes provoked intense anxiety about the disastrous consequences that would follow. Despite the negative public discourse and the stringent measures this legitimated, the much prophesied disaster never eventuated. Now, this pattern has been repeated periodically over the last 165 years, with the Australian psyche scarred by an invasion complex that posits racialized immigrant others peering covetously over Australia's backyard fence, threatening the inviolability of Australia's fair and egalitarian national culture. And the dissonance between a belief in equal rights and discourses and the rejection of immigrant others has been mediated by discourses of racial difference and operationalized through an immigration apparatus that delineated desirability according to race. So attitudes towards immigrants structured around race have been both constituted by and constitutive of specific understandings of what it means to be Australian. And it is these intersections between immigration, race, and the nation that this thesis aims to explore. So by examining the metaphors used in the press to frame immigration over the last 165 years, the research asks what stories are being told when we construct immigrants in certain ways. And moreover, how do these stories about Australia's others relate to the stories which construct the Australian national self? So a brief outline, I'm gonna look a little bit at the background, then give you my research questions and briefly cover my methodology. Then the results are divided into three sections. So the research has been divided into three sections, and these are pre-Federation, White Australia, and Multicultural Australia. And then I'll briefly touch on some of the discussion points and the implications that this has. So the imagined communities through which national identity is constituted are imagined as both inherently limited and sovereign. And when imagining Australia, the limits have traditionally been set along racial lines, with a privileging of white Britishness and a simultaneous dehumanization of the continent's indigenous peoples. Yet the naturalization of whiteness as a key feature of Australian identity does not or did not represent any tangible or true ethnic or racial basis. So it's through the construction of nations that populations are racialized, with race deeply imbricated with nationalism. And Balabar speaks of the cycle of historical reciprocity of nationalism and racism, concluding racism is constantly emerging out of nationalism, not only towards the exterior, but towards the interior. And national identity, while imagined, is not necessarily imagined consciously. So Billig uses the term banal nationalism to describe the myriad ways, subtle, implicit ways in which nationhood and national identity are flagged, from the unnoticed flag hanging on a building to the seemingly innocent we of newspaper discourse. Yet while nationalisms may be banal, it was not always so. So prior to the banal nationalisms in which Australia is implicitly hailed as white, there were conscious, explicit nationalisms when it was emphatically hailed as such. So the nation is given form by narratives, yet narratives about the nation are neither neutral nor true, but instead are powerfully productive, accomplishing essential discursive work. What it means to be Australian is defined by the narratives that are told, yet these are always made in relation to other ways of being that are marked as similar or different. Thus, narratives of nations others are thus essential to narratives of the national self, with the nationalist project creating a collective sense of self defined dialectically by the presence of the other. So this study is a critical discourse analysis of the metaphors used to construct immigration and the nation within the Australian press. And as a diachronic study, the aim is to trace the origins of certain persistent metaphoric constructions, to explore how they construct particular narratives of the nation and its others, and to account for the ongoing currency of metaphors that are rooted in racialized hierarchical distinctions. And moreover, as the quote suggests, by drawing attention to the ways in which the nation is persistently constructed around particular categorizations, the intention is to open up the possibilities for newer, more inclusive ways of imagining the nation. So critical discourse analysis is underpinned by the interactions between discourse, ideology, and power. So discourse is understood here as the ways of acting, representing, and being that produce and reproduce the relationship between society at its structural level and the way in which social reality is lived and experienced. And as social realities can be multiple, dependent on social positioning, so discourses are multiple. However, within any society, certain discourses achieve dominance. And it is these dominant discourses that are of interest when examining how the exclusion of certain groups contributes to the sustenance of dominant group interests. And linked to discourse is the role of ideology. And ideology can be described as representations of aspects of the world which contribute to establishing, maintaining, and changing social relations of power, domination, and exploitation. Arguments for this period are that the presence of immigrant others complicated settler claims to the land. And through pre-existing metaphors of threat and deviance, Chinese immigrants were constructed as a racialized deviant outgroup, with this explicitly legitimating their exclusion from the colonies, while simultaneously, implicitly legitimating settler colonial occupation. And furthermore, that the construction of a lesser racial other simultaneously constructed the white Australian settler group, unified in their desire for an egalitarian political community, levelling earlier class-based distinctions in the process. So turning first to nation metaphors. Now, metaphors used to frame migration do not exist in isolation. They're only comprehensible in relation to other metaphoric framings. So as the threat from immigration is most commonly conceived of in national terms, the corresponding metaphor generally structures the nation. Now, during the 1850s, Australia was still a collection of colonies. So the earliest metaphors constructed colonies, not the nation. Yet the turn towards federation and nationalism from the 1880s onwards was accompanied by the invocation of an Australian national house. Now, this shift from colonies, considering themselves as kind of individual houses, towards being a singular entity occurred more consistently from 1887. Reflecting the wider shift of colonies viewing themselves as part of a self-contained nation, which eventuated in federation. So the metaphors against which immigration was constructed in this period constructed the national in-group as a self-contained whole, to which immigrants were intrinsically external and threatening. Yet it was only through the immigrant outgroup that the nation house was constituted. So that is only through closing the doors did the house exist, making immigrant others foundational to the construction of the national self. So these are the metaphors, the main metaphors from this period. Now, the most common conceptual metaphors, immigration as dangerous water and immigration as war, were highly persuasive in positioning immigrants as essentially exterior to and threatening of the colony or nation. So immigrants were constructed as a dangerous, undifferentiated mass with their individual humanity obscured. Now, the use of war and particularly invasion metaphors are particularly salient. So settler colonial claims to territory were dependent on the elimination of indigenous peoples alongside a disavowal of this violence of dispossession, the inherent trauma of which generated ongoing anxieties about legitimacy. So through the displacement of the invasion onto the Chinese, there was an erasure of the colony's foundational violence alongside an affirmation of settler legitimacy. Now, the other main conceptual metaphors used to discuss immigration were immigrant as savage and immigrant as animal. So whereas dangerous water and war metaphors constructed immigrants as inherently external and threatening, these metaphors structured migrants in negative relations to the colonists. So when migrant savageness was flagged, it was done in relation to the implied civilization of the colonists. And likewise, their bestial nature was also a flagging of the humanity of the colony. And through such constructions, the superiority and humanity of the colonists was preserved, while simultaneously justifying inhumane or uncivilized treatment and restrictions. So these are some samples. The most substantial use of metaphors was in the Argos between 1854 and 1856. So precipitated by the gold rush, the Chinese population increased dramatically. Yet racialized discourses around the Chinese were the product of specific political and economic circumstances and the social relations engendered by these. Now, while such discourses took place against an underlying framework of biological racial difference, their elaboration into specific anti-Chinese rhetoric was generated within a context of working class economic security, concerns about working class morality, and also concerns about settler legitimacy. By racializing the Chinese in terms of inferiority, deviance, and threat, the economic hardship and frustration of the working classes, alongside the class-based concerns about morality of the middle classes, could all be redirected towards an identifiable, easily identifiable, visible minority. So immigrants were often simultaneously constructed as dangerous waters, enemies, animals, savages, rubbish, and contaminants, all within a single article. So these are just a few metaphors from one sample article, and this is the kind of general tenor of the articles in this period. But this cluster of interrelated metaphors used in intensely negative articles only really appeared in this 3-month period surrounding the passing of Victoria's anti-Chinese legislation. Both before and after this, the frequency and density of metaphors, as well as the kind of negative tenor of the articles, was greatly reduced. So these articles were a particular type of representation that was mobilized in specific circumstances. Now, the role of prior anti-convict sentiment is really crucial to understanding the language used to frame the Chinese. So anti-Chinese rhetoric mirrored earlier anti-convict sentiment, ostensibly grounded in a similar antipathy to any form of cheap labour. So there was growing opposition to the transportation of convicts to Australia. So focused on morality and degeneracy, with convicts as the lowest class, most degraded members of society. And after the arrival of the Chinese, their undesirability was articulated in the same terms as those already ascribed to the most undesirable members of settler society. So unsurprisingly then, comparable metaphoric language was found in an article about convicts printed just months before the article on the previous slide. So if you replace convict with Chinese, and crime-stained ruffians with pig-tailed barbarians, and felons with Tatars, the article could pass as any of a multitude that were published in the following months, with words like threat, evil, invasion, influx, degraded incursion, all of these kind of commonplace in articles about the Chinese. Now, settler colonial identity was premised on this superior claim to the land, as I've already said, yet this was undermined by the perceived deviance of some settlers, in particular convicts. Now, the ongoing anxieties this generated alongside the wider anxieties of legitimacy were further challenged by the arrival of the Chinese. So compared to the settlers, the Chinese worked longer hours, they survived on less resources, and they were better able to work the land. Given also the geographical proximity to China and the greater number of Chinese, there was really strong potential for the Chinese to stake a more valid claim to the land. So the construction of the Chinese as racially other and inferior served a dual purpose, both invalidating the legitimacy of Chinese claims while simultaneously elevating the position of the white settler as even the lowest white man was comparably superior to the Chinese because they were white. And this displacement of deviance from convicts to the Chinese can account for the richness of negative metaphoric framing that occurred immediately that the Chinese were deemed undesirable, with a language already used to describe undesirable whites harnessed to denigrate the Chinese. So this is racecraft. This is, familiar cultural representations of subjugation, feeding the emergence of new ones. However, from the point at which this metaphoric language became applied to the Chinese, it was not observed in any articles about white immigration. So it appears that what was initially a class-based grammar of undesirability and deviance rapidly became codified as racially specific, being applied only to those seen as racially other. So while the Chinese were metaphorically racialized through the use of class-based metaphors, the metaphors themselves also became racialized through their application to the Chinese, becoming codified as signifiers of race. So moving on to the next period, to the White Australia period. So Australia became a nation on the 1st of January 1901, with the restriction of non-white immigration enshrined in the Immigration Restriction Act. And the White Australia policy, which the Act embodied, shaped Australia's first 70 years of nationhood. And it is these decades when whiteness, or lack thereof, was explicitly invoked in both the national self and its immigrant others that are the focus for this period. So turning to Bourdieu's work on power, the creation of the Australian nation could be understood as a form of symbolic production. That is, through the economic and coercive power endowed by the process of nation-state creation, the founders of the new Australian state were also engaged in the creation of forms of symbolic power to define the categorizations and limits of the imagined cultural community. And the political function of these symbolic systems was as instruments which helped to ensure that one class dominates the another. So thus, as instruments of symbolic violence. And Bourdieu speaks of language as possessing the power to produce existence by producing the collectively recognized representation of existence. So keeping in mind the essential kind of fictionality of the developing Australian national imaginary, this section argues that metaphoric representations were harnessed to create specific understandings of Australianness that reflected and sustained the Anglo-white power base that gave rise to them. And while the Asian immigrant other was still of concern in the early decades of the century, during the 1920s, there was a notable shift to Italians becoming the focal point for racial anxieties. And during this period, Italians were racialized as non-white through the same metaphors that were used to racialize other non-white groups, which again only dissipated once legislative restrictions had been enacted. So turning first to the nation as a body metaphor constructed a unified social body, legitimately ruled by its head, with proclamations about the nation body issued by the voice of the nation, naturalizing partial interested perspectives as universal. So the invoking of the nation body was a powerful expression of symbolic power through which the perspectives, interests and aims of certain elite groups were naturalized. And the symbolic creation of the nation was also expressed in nation as house metaphors, which were a constructive strategy for the national in-group, simultaneously constructing the immigrant out-group to whom the door needed to be opened. So such metaphors are instances of banal nationalism with a persistent, unremarked flagging of the British ethno-national community as the true inhabitants of the nation house. And a much more explicitly ethno-nationalist structuring of the nation was of the nation as part of a wider Anglo family, with immigrants from Britain or the Dominions framed through familial metaphors. So national psychology is often anchored around a subconscious belief that all members of the national group share a common origin and have evolved distinctly from other national groups. And such ethno-nationalism often finds expression in familial metaphors. And in the Australian context, this was commonly articulated through the terms kindred or kith and kin to describe immigrants from Britain. And this shaped the way migrants were valued, with kindred perceived as more beneficial, more naturally beneficial than other migrants. So these are the metaphors, the threat and deviance metaphors that were found during this period. And as you can see, the majority of metaphors were found in the 1920s, which is when the use of all negative metaphors peaked. So while Asians were a focus in the first 2 decades, the 1920s were predominantly focused on Italian immigration. So while non-Anglo-white immigrant groups were differentially constructed during white Australia, they were not constructed as floods, invaders, swarms, or inferior. And that such metaphors were explicitly connected to the construction of the nation as a white space is evidenced by the substantial decline after World War II, when discourses of Italian racial difference also declined. So moving on then. These are some samples of Italian-focused metaphors. So prior to the 1920s, non-white immigration had mostly been contained. But the US immigration laws of the early 1920s and the resultant fears that more Italians would therefore move to Australia coalesced with a resurgent identification with Britishness alongside an emphasis on racial purity. And as well as these kind of existing ambivalence about Italian racial origins, resulting in racially defined fears of Italian immigration. And much like the anti-Chinese rhetoric of the 1850s, the framing of the undesirability of Italian immigrants resulted in an escalation and intensification of negative metaphors, which only subsided once immigration restriction legislation had been enacted. So moving on to the last period, I'm going as fast as I can. The ending of the white Australia period saw the increasing admittance of non-white people, with their presence challenging well-established understandings of what it meant to be Australian. And while the focus of the White Australia part was on how the nation was imagined as a white space, the focus here is on what happened when this space could no longer be explicitly claimed for whiteness. So Bourdieu's concepts of habitus and field are a key focus for this part. So habitus functions to structure social reality internally, and externally this is structured through fields, with the two kind of mutually constitutive and sustaining. So Haja said that within Australia, it is national belonging that constitutes the symbolic capital of the field. So that is, national belonging is the symbolic capital that ensures recognition that subjects legitimately belong to the nation. And within Australia, this capital can equate to language, so speaking English, looks, cultural practice, white skin, Australian accent, being of British descent. So possession of the symbolic capital of national belonging is also a key source of symbolic power. So the argument that I make here is that national identity and belonging can itself be understood not just as capital, but as a form of habitus. That is, as a set of dispositions that are inculcated in part through the banal metaphoric structuring of immigrants in the nation to recognize the symbolic value of specific forms of national capital. So the metaphoric constructions of the nation house or the immigrant influx engender perceptions of national belonging anchored in older ethno-nationalist understandings of the nation, reaffirming the value of Anglo-white capital, with this inhibiting the possibilities for newer, more diverse understandings. Now, while metaphors were observed in increasing numbers for specific non-white groups, alongside an increasing problematization of immigration, the highest number of metaphors were used to frame asylum seekers. So through the use of racializing metaphors, asylum seekers were also racialized and imbricated within an existing narrative of immigrant threat. And much like in pre-Federation and white Australia times, the construction of a racialized immigrant other was a means by which a white national self could be constructed, while the shifting of narratives of racial others to the borders was a means to perpetuate this discourse outside, while simultaneously retaining a national self-image as diverse and tolerant within multicultural Australia. So similarly to the white Australia period, nation as body metaphors continue to shape an understanding of the Australian populace as a singular mass. Yet this was not explicitly white. Instead, the most notable feature of body metaphors was the manner in which various groups were explicitly differentiated and remarked upon, be this specifically non-white nationality groups, refugees, or increasingly immigrants, while European or British migrants were not specifically spoken about. So the distinction occurred not so much in the problematization of certain types of immigration, but rather in the lack of comment on others. So the identity of the nation body was defined by those who were perceived as external, with the noting of their intake or absorption highlighting their difference from the nation body, unlike immigrants whose intake elicited no remark. And house metaphors were almost exclusively applied to those perceived as naturally and racially external to the nation house. So through the flagging of certain groups as external, i.e. through the opening and closing of the nation doors to them, the position of the groups not commented on as the true inhabitants of the nation house is naturalized. So the main metaphors to frame immigration were again dangerous water and war metaphors, with both overwhelmingly applied to asylum seekers or specifically non-white immigration. So this mirrors the way that racially undesirable immigration was constructed within the white Australia period, suggesting that asylum seekers and other non-white immigrants were often also perceived as racially undesirable. And many of the metaphors within this period constructed threats around national security as opposed to cultural and social degeneration, with danger stemming from immigrant illegitimacy and illegality. And this construction of immigrant undesirability through the prism of criminality is a discursive tool whereby ethno-nationalist sentiments can be expressed through the language of civic nationalism, circumventing the negative associations of explicitly ethno-nationalist language. So as such, it is possible to preserve a national self-image as fair and egalitarian while decrying the criminality of the racialized other. And there were also wider discourses of deviance, conflating ethnic minorities with criminality, exemplified in metaphors like ghettos, with the metaphor reproducing the threat and deviance of both immigrants and the spaces that they lived in. And this allowed for this kind of internal yet external structuring of threat. So immigrant spaces were delimited from the national space. So the internal threat was externalized from an imagined kind of diverse and harmonious national space. So asylum seekers were extensively constructed through dangerous water and war metaphors, accounting for about 70% of both. And in addition, asylum seekers were also constructed as deviant, with many metaphors highlighting the kind of purported illegitimacy and criminality of asylum seeking itself. So the most famous of these metaphors, the queue jumper, originated with the first arrivals of asylum seeker boats. And it shaped a differential structuring of kind of bad boat arrivals and good refugees waiting in camps. And this gave legitimacy to governmental concerns while deflecting potential criticism, as the vilification of the queue jumpers was articulated in the name of the fictional good refugees from whom the queue jumpers were stealing. And the alignment of this good-bad dichotomy with the offence towards the kind of quintessential Australian values kind of embedded within the concept of queue jumping reinforced asylum seeker illegitimacy, kind of justifying punitive responses. And there was also a proliferation of metaphors that framed asylum seeking as a form of business transaction, which included expressions like cargo and customer and trade. And again, the focus on asylum seekers having bought their way to Australia was a means to delegitimise them. So this research demonstrates that asylum seekers that arrive by boat have constantly been the object of racialized discourse. Yet the identification of asylum seekers as the kind of totemic immigrant other within the multicultural period can be dated to John Howard's anti-asylum seeker policies around Tampa. And it is in this period that asylum seekers become fully racialized as the object of a kind of a vehement discourse around immigration, sovereignty, and security. And the timing of this was no accident. So just as the construction of a Chinese invasion in the 1800s displaced settler colonial anxiety around legitimacy, the construction of asylum seekers in this period functioned in the same way. So the period leading up to the Tampa had been marked by an increasing focus on Aboriginal land rights. Yet with the onset of anti-asylum seeker discourse, the push for reconciliation lost prominence, leading to what has been called the ditching of Indigenous issues. So I would suggest that this shift away from Indigenous rights was a direct result of the manner in which the discourse around asylum seekers were constructed. So it's no accident that the most prominent asylum seeker specific metaphors centered on their illegitimacy, with the threat conceived of in terms of national sovereignty. So through the construction of an illegitimate immigrant other who was illegitimate in direct relation to Australian national sovereignty, the legitimacy of the nation as a white possession was restated. And the particular potency of this narrative was that it allowed even opponents of the government's policies to articulate their objections from a position of sovereignty. So in every statement kind of promoting the acceptance of asylum seekers, there's still an expression of what Haj has called governmental belonging. So in saying we believe they have the right to come to our country, there is still a reiteration of the nation as our possession. So through the construction of the asylum seeker other, anxieties and debate around Indigenous sovereignty and settler colonial legitimacy were neutralized, much like with the Chinese 150 years earlier. And this reorientation of discourse was a new elaboration of the narrative of racialized immigrant others, against which narratives of Australian nationalism have consistently been defined. So, both the nation, coming then to the kind of the end, both the nation and its others are racialized by metaphors. So racialization is a dialectical process of signification. So the racialized constructions of others are the dialectical means by which the national self is also constructive. And narratives of immigrant threat are consistently articulated in relation to narratives of being Australian. So for over 165 years, the narratives of who we are as Australians have been constructed or have been structured by metaphors that simultaneously construct some groups as internal and legitimate and others as external and threatening. And the rearticulation of older immigrant threats through the use of the same metaphors allows for a racialized continuity in both the immigrant other and the national self. However, while both white and non-white groups are racialized, the racialization of non-white others is also racist. It's not just racialization, it's racist. And this stems from its explicitly negative evaluative component. And more than this, they are institutionally racist, both as originating from the state originally and now as a racist discourse that is reconstituted in an apparently non-racist discourse. So while nationalism and racism are two separate ideologies, they are often intertwined with each other. So Balabar describes racism as a supplement of nationalism. And while ethno-nationalism is not necessarily racist in and of itself, the particular identifications of Australian ethno-nationalism embodied by these metaphors were formed by the convergence of nationalism and racism. So while they may not be currently incorporated in an explicitly racist discourse, the nationalism they hail is a racial and racist one. So turning then to the implications. So what do we need to take from this? Well, the first thing is that narratives do work. So as Elder says, you know, the nation needs to be continually told in order to give it substance, to disavow the differences and to reinforce what it is not. And the ongoing salience of the immigrant threat narrative is in the opportunity for a racially constructed sense of national identity. And narratives of immigrant threat also displace settler colonial anxieties. So what to do then? So in order to overturn the immigrant threat narrative and the metaphoric structures that give shape to it, a radical rethinking of national identity is needed. And this is possible. So narratives of Australian national identity are multiple and often contradictory. In addition to the dominant narratives, there are alternative narratives that have the potential to disrupt, subvert, and contest the narratives that continue to center specific historical understandings of national belonging. So this is what Homi Bhabha speaks of as those alternative constituencies of people and oppositional analytical capacities that may emerge. You know, they assign new meanings and different directions to the process of historical change. But attending to new meanings takes work. There's a need to move beyond simply decentering ethno-nationalist understandings of what it means to be Australian and engage with the cognitive dissonance that underpins Australian national identity. And kind of in the process, reconfiguring the relationship between white Australia and its Indigenous others, and kind of systematically decentering whiteness and deconstructing white possessive sovereignty, and fundamentally reconstructing the Australian national imaginary. Because as long as there is a failure to engage with the disavowed trauma at the heart of Australian national identity, the invasion fears constructed around demonized immigrant others that have plagued the nation will continue, as will the metaphors and narratives through which they are constituted. And there are some books. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Katie, for a very...
Can I stop sharing my screen?
Yes, yes, you can stop sharing it. That's fine.
Okay.
Okay.
Is that better?
Yes, that's better. Okay.
Sorry if I went too fast. I was trying to get through it all.
That's okay. It's very, I mean, I can see you mentioned about, this is like putting all 4 years of research. Yes, it's very
it's a lot.
Yes, it's a lot. Do we have questions? Trying to see whether anyone has raised. Yes, we have one here already. Sam?
Yes.
Yes. Please.
Yeah, interesting talk. I have 2 questions.
Okay.
So, first of all, you showed the overall.
Sorry, could you say that again? You were breaking up.
Sorry. Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Okay. So earlier on, you had the chart of the use of metaphors over the White Australia policy, and there was a general decline across the board. But in particular, there was a complete collapse in the use of subhuman metaphors leading up to the end of World War II. I was wondering if, like, a reason for that emerged during your research. And the other question was, I was wondering if you'd encountered any positive uses of sort of the floods and flows metaphor, because you don't see it very often, but like a recent-ish example I think of is Jeb Bush during his failed presidential bid tried to construct an elaborate metaphor connecting immigration and hydroelectric power plants. So, yes.
Yeah, absolutely. They're really good questions. So the subhuman one, that was mostly talking about people as being racially inferior. And the reason that declines is because after kind of World War II, we stop hearing about races as being inferior. It becomes taboo to start saying this. You know, after the Nazis, that there is this general shift towards away from actually saying that another race is biologically inferior, which is why that just kind of disappears at that point. And when we get the metaphors that come back in multicultural Australia, we don't often see inferior. We see the animals and the dangerous water, but it's one of those things that became quite taboo. It's very, very kind of linked to racial classifications. And there is this real shift from kind of biological ideas of race towards this emphasis on culture, so cultural forms of racism that kind of comes about after the Second World War. And in terms of positive uses, yes, there was. Not through most of it, but what we find in the White Australia period, and I didn't have time to go through it, so I'm glad you asked me. In the White Australia period, you get this differential structuring of immigration. So white immigrants are being structured as a resource. And in the early kind of years of the White Australia period, it's mostly British and Northern Europeans, but this, especially in the kind of post-World War II populate or perish kind of atmosphere, kind of includes all Europeans. And so we get this flowing water metaphor that comes about, and it's like a steady stream, and we need a steady flow. And we also metaphors talking about them as a source of population and reservoirs of population. So we do very much get this kind of this structuring of immigrants as a resource, and very kind of positive water metaphors. But then they seem to kind of dissipate again once we get into multicultural Australia. This kind of positive structuring of immigration disappears. And I think what we find is that when there is no racial other, so once the Italians stop being the racial other, we start kind of getting this differential structuring of British and other white immigration, but it's not being structured as necessarily negative. So there are distinctions, and it's kind of aligned more around what we'd call ethnicity rather than race. But once race comes back into it, again, we shift back to it being mostly conceived of in racial terms. So when there's no racial other, immigration can be conceived of around ethnicity, but once race comes back, when other kind of races come back in, we lose those positive metaphors. But there was a lot of it around in the kind of the 50s and the 60s, and yeah, with immigrants being seen in very kind of, it wasn't, we can have as many as we like. They were a resource if they were managed as a resource, if you know what I mean.
Yes, interesting.
Yeah, it was nice to find some good stuff actually.
Okay. Now we have Laura, and then Greg and Martin. Okay. Laura?
Well, thank you very much for your presentation. This is really an amazing work. I'm really amazed by how much material you have analyzed in the huge period that you are looking at. So yes, that was very, very interesting, and congratulations for all that work.
Thank you.
And yet I'm bringing in more things, so I apologize for that, but I am aware you cannot cover everything. But I had the impression in your presentation that those whole metaphors and discourses were constructed by Australia, somehow in isolation of what was happening elsewhere in the world. So if we think, for instance, in the current period, I mean, all the metaphors that you are highlighting, like, water, war, and so on, these are metaphors that you can find more globally in other countries. I'm thinking about rhetorics around, that nourished the Brexit, or, racist discourse in the US, and you can find that in other European countries. So I was wondering if you were also incorporating, external influences and not just what's happening inside the borders of the nation.
I think that's a really good point. And you see it as well, like, for instance, in the 1920s, a lot of the stuff that's coming over is coming from America. They're talking about within America. And you can even with the kind of, in the current times, they're talking about immigrants. There's this kind of increased problematization about immigrants, which is we're also seeing in Europe and in the UK. And it's kind of happening in different contexts in each country. I mean, in terms of the analysis, I haven't been able to incorporate anything external. So I've literally been looking at how these develop within Australia, so how they are being used within Australia. And at points I've been able to kind of say, well, this mirrors something, you know, this drawing on academic text. So I've kind of drawn on stuff about the Italians in the US in the 20s, but I haven't actually been able to go and do the research on the actual texts. So I've been able to bring in a little bit, but as it is, it's already been massive, you know, it's been beyond, you know, so, but it would be really, really good to take one period and actually look at how it's kind of interacting around the world, specifically now, I think, but because there's kind of greater kind of interaction than ever, but also looking in the 1920s, looking at the way in which race was being constructed across, you know, across the Pacific, and how these two were feeding into each other, very much so. And I think, you know, it is a huge other area that you could bring into it, and it would be fascinating. I would love to. So
but maybe there might be also a way of bringing it without having to analyze more material, but also think about, you know, the press and discourses in the press are constructed globally. And newspapers are part of wider groups which are, you know, in the hands of people who might be active in constructing that kind of discourses. So I mean, maybe just explaining who those newspapers are and what kind of influence they might have.
Well, particularly now, I think, because I've got the Australian, and you can see the same thing happening in kind of in Murdoch papers all around the world. Yeah. You know, this is less the case in the earlier days. I mean, so I have kind of done an analysis for the newspapers, and especially in the kind of the 1800s, the press were very, very, very Australian, very kind of provincial. But yeah, absolutely. nowadays, I mean, and you can see that the similarities with Murdoch discourse around the world. It's brutal. I mean, it's awful. But I mean, you can definitely see them. I am trying to bring it in where possible, but probably I'm already massively over, so I need to, but it is really, really interesting and really important, I think. You know, I think it's true that they don't exist in isolation, particularly now.
Okay, thank you.
Sorry, I'm on mute. Okay. We have Greg, but first I'd like to ask Erin, did you raise your hand, or? I wasn't really sure whether that's raising hand or clapping. Okay. Greg, please, your question.
Yeah, thanks for a hugely encompassing and interesting talk. My question is somewhat related to Laura's. I'm wondering how the term race was defined in these newspapers and such. What were the criteria that defined a race? I'm motivated to ask this question by certain things. I was struck by your quote that talked about the Tartars. You know, the Tartars are not the same as the Han Chinese. I'm wondering, for example, where the Japanese fit in with this. There wasn't a huge migration, but you know, there were Japanese coming in the pearling industry in Broome, where in the colonial Dutch East Indies, the Japanese were considered equivalent to the Dutch, whereas the Vreemde Oosterlinge, the foreign Orientals, were the Arabs, Indians, and Chinese. You know, you talked about the shift to Italians, and your quotes also indicated Eastern Europeans as well as Southern Europeans. So I'm wondering, what were the criteria that defined race in terms of the other, and then how did this shift over time, and how did the shifting of criteria relate to who gets included and who gets excluded?
Yeah, so it's really interesting because race is being used in so many different ways. So it's being used to talk about the Anglo. So initially, you've got the idea of the kind of the typological theories of race. So the Chinese are being seen as Mongolian as opposed to Caucasian, and then increasingly we get things like, so we get the Anglo-Saxon race, we get the British race, we get the white race, we get the Australian race in terms of whiteness, and then in terms of other races, we get Italian as a race. We also get them as the Mediterranean race compared to the Nordic and the Alpine within Europe. And then we get Asians and the Asian race, or generally as Asians. So there isn't any race itself as a concept. It's being used in multiple ways that kind of overlap within this period. So the way that I'm defining race is in terms of whiteness and non-whiteness, which seems to be this binary that becomes white Australia and everyone else becomes non-white. So, and there's kind of, like Marilyn Lake talks about how there's this shift from lots of different kind of racial and cultural and to just being white or non-white. There's not this proliferation of racial types. And that seems to be how it's being perceived in terms of immigration restriction. So there is this idea of if you're white, you can come in, and if you're not white, you can't. And this is where Italians kind of fall down the middle, because are they white? Are they not? They're racially different. They're not the same as other Europeans, and you know, Nordic and Alpine, well, they're white, but Italians, it was kind of unsure. And it was only when Italians became kind of classified as white that they start being accepted, you know, with a lot less kind of, you know, anxiety and ambivalence. But even in the 50s, their whiteness was still suspect. But it was being kind of, it was being conferred on them, even though it was still, they were still being examined, and they were checking their fingernails and their buttocks to see if there's hidden signs of race. So in terms of how race was classified, it was really, really complex. It was really, really complex. But in terms of how, when we look at these metaphors, these negative metaphors are only being applied to people who are being perceived as non-white. And usually these were Asians. In the 1890s, it's Syrians and Hindus and Afghans, and then it becomes Italians. And then in multicultural Australia, it's you know, Asians predominantly, Middle Eastern, you know, Sudanese, you know, asylum seekers who then also become racialized because they are also being seen as not white. And then of course this increasing immigration, which again is a kind of a flagging for non-white immigrants. So yeah, but in terms of how it was, there's no easy answer. It was really complex. It was very, very complex. Interesting, but complex, and a little bit confusing at times.
Thanks. So Martin. And then we have Farida after that.
Yep. Thanks, Catherine, for really a very polished, lucid talk based on very rich research, and for other feedback too. I thought it was actually very well paced. I certainly never lost track. It was always clear. So I'm interested to know more about the triangulation of this data, and perhaps to raise an impression I have here. So you're the one who's got the research. I've only got, you know, my own kind of stories and experiences of particular eras. I'm old enough to talk about it in that way now. But I believe that I can remember a time where I felt that the Australian was probably the mid-90s, early 90s, that the Australian was expressing an openness to asylum seekers that changed again. There's no question about that, but I certainly had an impression of that in that era. So Australian newspaper. In the 90s, yeah, that there was a shift in the discourse in that particular newspaper. So that's why I'd be interested in hearing about, is because what we've actually had is a pretty solid representation of, as you called it at the end, the Australian national imaginary. The national imaginary. And I'm just wondering if there isn't perhaps a little bit more nuance that we might need to explore here. And I suppose what I was thinking about then also was about these metaphors, that, you know, the couple there, but I'm surprised that something like, say, the mosaic metaphor doesn't appear, say, from about the 1980s, as we move towards an acceptance of multiculturalism, or struggling with that in whatever way. So, you know, did that not start to appear in some of that discourse? I suppose the other thing I'd welcome some reflection on is, when you left in 2018, you know, into the 2000s and so on, with the Australian, the West Australian, and the Sydney Morning Herald, you've got issues there about representativeness of the national imaginary that I think is different to the say the 1950s or something like that. So I'm just interested in how you're dealing with, or if you're dealing with that kind of an issue in your final writing around this, reflections on it.
Yeah, no, great. So starting first with triangulation, So for triangulation, I was looking at parliamentary debates, letters to the editor, so letters to the editor, parliamentary debates, legislation, public meetings, and I looked at key points where metaphor usage peaked. So the 1850s, 1887, 88, the 1920s, and then 2001 and 2012-13. So yeah, there was just these kind of key points, and generally it matched. So when you're getting high points in the newspapers, these are also matching what's kind of coming across in wider kind of public discourse. Now, in terms of the Australian newspaper, you're talking about the Australian newspaper, is that right? Yeah, so the Australian newspaper actually has changed heaps. So in the 60s and early 70s, it was amazing. It was progressive, and it was the nicest paper of all of them. And then when I was doing my research on the Australian, it's because the editor was called, I think, Adrian Deemer, and he was very progressive. And so they had, female journalists, they had the first Aboriginal journalist, they covered arts and culture, but then he got fired. And then with Murdoch, it's kind of generally shifted further and further. But you're right, it wasn't that bad. It's only really been like the last kind of 10, 15 years, there's been a real noticeable shift in the rhetoric. So even in 2000, 2001, 2002, there was negative, but there was also positive. Now it's just very, very, very populist and very difficult to read. So yeah, it was better. It started off great. It's kind of progressively kind of degenerated, I would say. Things like Mosaic, yeah, they were there. We did get things like Mosaic, but they just weren't. I mean, for each of my periods, I had between 20 and 28 conceptual metaphors. And by the last period, I had like over 400 individual different metaphors. So it wasn't one of the key metaphors. It wasn't that prominent. So I haven't been able to focus on it, but it certainly is something I might write a paper about at some point, because it's really interesting. There's some really, really interesting stuff about the nation, and we get lots of stuff about social fabric, and melting pot comes back a little bit. So in the White Australia period, it's about kind of the US and the melting pot, and it's not really being taken on board. But then it kind of comes in a little bit. There's the melting pot, but then we say it was not a melting pot, it's a mosaic, and that does definitely appear. And unfortunately, there hasn't really been, there's just not enough space within, my dissertation to cover it. And in terms of the national imaginary, I mean, when I'm speaking of national imaginaries, there is this kind of underlying, I'm trying to emphasize, but maybe I'll make sure I'm doing it more clearly, that, this isn't the only way that the nation is being imagined. And the other thing is that these metaphors are not the only way that the nation is being spoken about. And the claims that I'm making about what's happening with these metaphors, it's not saying that these are the only ways. It's saying that there is a certain type of kind of national imaginary that is being kind of flagged or inculcated by these uses of metaphors. And that's what's happening with these metaphors. I mean, there are lots of, and that's the potential for kind of moving beyond. There is more than one. There are more, and this isn't the only narrative. Like narratives of immigrant threats, certainly not in the last kind of however many decades. There's so many narratives of immigrants that aren't this negative. So it's more looking at what's happening when these metaphors are there, rather than kind of making any kind of statements about what's happening when they're not. Does that make sense?
Yeah. So,
yeah. That's nicely put. Yep.
Thanks, Katie. So we have Farida. I think it's going to be the last questions for our seminar today.
Thanks, Utari. And thanks, Kathy. And I do feel the need to claim you because you did such a good job, and along with Stephen as your supervisors. Well done.
Thank you. Thank you both.
But I was kind of surprised by your happy ending. I think the problem is the nation state, and I'm not sure that we can remediate it. We know from the data that even people who are trying to challenge the metaphors in a positive way, they're still using the metaphors to talk about the nation as container, and the existing population as those who have the right to control that. So they might not be talking about waves, or they might challenge the idea that it's a wave of asylum seekers and say, oh, it's a mere trickle or whatever, but it's still reinforcing the same sort of negative ideas. So, I mean, as you know, I think that the problem is the nation state, and it's irremediable. So yeah, I'd just like to press you a little bit on that.
Yeah, I didn't think I was being that positive. I've said, you know, you need to reconfigure. This is what maybe I rushed through it a bit, like reconfiguring the relationship between white Australia and its indigenous others, holistically and systematically decentering whiteness, deconstructing white possessive sovereignty, and fundamentally reconstructing the Australian national imaginary. I didn't think that was positive. I was like, no, we need to change everything. You know, because we're not going to change this unless we get rid of, because this is one of the things that I try to bring out in the actual PhD, you know, that these ideas about history and identity, they're also ideas about who we are now and the power, and it's a legitimation of power imbalances, and until we actually resolve this kind of fundamental, kind of huge gaping kind of chasm at the heart of what it is to be Australian, which is being caused by this huge dissonance, you know, like we're an egalitarian fair country which still doesn't recognize its indigenous others. You know, we still have Australia Day as our national day, when we recognize there's been over 60,000 years of inhabitation, but we'll use just the absolute cognitive dissonance. I mean, I try to not be really, really negative. That's why I said it's possible. But my belief is that, you know, we can't get rid of these metaphors and these narratives because they're doing work, and until they don't need to do that work, they're not going anywhere. And that work is massive, and it takes a huge kind of real reconfiguration of who we are, you know. But try not to be too strong, but yeah, that's really how I feel.
Thanks, Kiri. I think we come to the end of our seminar. Let's just give Kiri an applause, and then
thank you.
All the best for the thesis. I'm really, really enjoying today's seminar.
Thank you very much. Thank you all so much for coming. It was actually really nice. I thought it was going to be awful, but I actually enjoyed it. So thank you.
Nice, isn't it? So next week we won't have seminar, because next week we have a discipline group meeting. We will meet again in the next 2 weeks. We will have Dr. S. Watson, and her presentation is titled Sociological Fiction. So thank you, everyone. Have a good rest of your day. This space will be open until the next 5 or 10 minutes. We can have a
Thank you. Thank you so much.